Hello everybody, before we dive into today's video, we're very happy to introduce one of our favorite sponsors to work with, the historic city of Quincy, Massachusetts. And yes, contrary to popular belief, both the city and the middle name of the United States' sixth president, John Quincy Adams, is supposed to be pronounced Quincy, not Quincy. In any event, ever wondered where the story of America's leadership took root? Quincy is that place. This city is home to the Adams National Historic Park, which preserves the home of Presidents John Adams and John Quincy Adams, two of America's founding fathers. You can explore the birthplaces of these iconic leaders and walk the same halls as they once did, immersing yourself in the beginnings of the United States. But Quincy isn't all about the past. It's a city that beautifully blends history with the present-day adventures and experiences. From the iconic USS Salem to the stunning views of the Blue Hills and the architectural elegance of the Thomas Crane Library and Old City Hall, there's something here for everyone. And let's not forget the Epicurean delight that is Quincy's food scene. With an array of global and local flavors, it's a culinary journey that you can't miss. To discover more about what Quincy has in store for you, check out discoverquincy.com. It's time to step into history and create some unforgettable memories. Now let's get into today's video. On June the 28th, 1839, a ship departed Havana, Cuba en route to Puerto Principe. Along with a crew of 7, including 2 slaves serving as a cabin boy and ship's cook, the vessel was also packed with cargo worth approximately $60,000, or about $1.7 million today. This included items ranging from wine, saddles, iron castings, mill rollers, fabrics, soap, leather goods, over 600 pounds of rice and many other foodstuffs, and most important to our story today, some 53 slaves. Among those 53 were 49 adults recently bought by a 24-year-old man named Jose Ruiz, with fellow Cuban plantation owner 58-year-old Pedros Montes purchasing 4 children, 3 girls, and 1 boy as well. All of these slaves, comprising about 1/3 of the total value of cargo on the ship, were slated to go to work on plantations in Puerto Principe. However, unfortunately for Ruiz and Montes, thanks to a taunting remark by the ship's cook, their newly purchased slaves had other ideas. What followed was a 2-year bid for freedom by the surviving captives of the Amistad. This all culminated in none other than former US President John Quincy Adams' impassioned defense of the captives before the Supreme Court, while then current US President Martin Van Buren's side pushed hard for their deportation back to Cuba. Here now is the real story of the Amistad and the harrowing bid for freedom of the men and women held captive aboard it. To begin with, let's talk a little about the ship's cook. A man by the name of Celestino, who was a slave owned by Captain Ramon Ferrer. While you might think Celestino's own legal status might make him sympathetic to the plight of the captives, he nonetheless had taken to mercilessly taunting them, including doing things like mockingly drinking large amounts of water in front of them. Note here, during the voyage, the captives were given only the bare minimum water needed to survive, leaving them in a perpetually extremely dehydrated state. More critically, Celestino also decided to insinuate to some of the captives, none of whom spoke English or Spanish, that upon arriving at their destination, they would be killed and eaten. He reportedly did so by pointing at them and drawing his knife across his throat, then making a chopping motion. Following this, he demonstrated taking the imaginary bits of flesh he just chopped up and pretended to eat them. He then gestured to the captives into an empty salted beef cask, implying their remains would end up there. Before we move on here, it's important to understand that it was common for those newly enslaved from the region these men and women were originally from to believe that the white men arriving on their floating houses were cannibals. How this idea got started isn't really clear today, but for example, at the time, West African slave owners used to threaten their slaves that if they didn't work hard enough, they would sell them to the white men who would then take them across the sea to be eaten. Whether Celestino knew about this general perception or not, his intimating that this is what would happen to the captives proved a fatal mistake, as every single account of the uprising by them would later cite this little performance by Celestino as the catalyst to decide attempting to take the ship was worth the risk. One of the captives, Kina, would later state of this, "We very unhappy all that night. We afraid we be killed. We consider what we should do." They then argued amongst themselves with another named Lubo stating, "No one ever conquered our nation, and even now we are not taken by fair means. Should we be slaughtered for cannibals or die fighting for life?" And so it was that on July the 1st, 4 nights after setting sail, one of the eventual leaders of the group, Cinque, managed to use a nail to pick a central padlock to partially get himself free. How specifically they all got fully free after this isn't totally clear today, with conflicting contemporary accounts, but all stating they somehow broke their remaining chains. Perhaps aiding in this, 2 of their company were formerly blacksmiths. However they did it, they were now free of their shackles. Searching around the hold, they found what weapons they could among their cargo, including a cache of sugarcane knives. From here, using a battle tactic common to their home tribes, they waited for the optimal time to strike when their enemy would be in the deepest sleep. That time came around 4 a.m. when only the sailor manning the helm was awake. From here, how they got past the grate to escape the hold is not totally clear either, whether it was accidentally left unlocked or if they simply picked or broke the lock as they had done with their chains. Whatever the case, Cinque, Facorna, Moru, and Kimbo, who all were experienced warriors, emerged from the hold. At this point, their first target was not the captain or even the one individual still awake, as you might expect. Rather, they went immediately for the slave Celestino, who was sleeping in the longboat. Fully would later recount of this. The cook was killed first by Cinque with a stick while lying in the boat. Reportedly, Celestino never knew what hit him, not making a sound while being killed in his sleep. However, the sounds of the attack nonetheless alerted the rest of the crew, and it was on. Initially, the crew did manage to drive their former captives back somewhat. Ruiz would later state of this point, "I then heard the captain order the cabin boy to go below and get some bread to throw among the Negroes, hoping to pacify them." Now, if you think that's a somewhat odd thing to order in the middle of a life or death mutiny, as alluded to, the captives were only given half-eat, half-drink portions, putting them in a quite literal, almost starved and dehydrated state. For example, their allotment of water was reportedly only a half a teacup full of water in the morning and another in the evening, and nothing else. This all despite floating around in the hot Caribbean during summer. That said, some were able to steal water from the ship's supplies, but not without extreme consequence, with, in one instance, Captain Ferrer brutally beating 5 of the captives with a cat-o'-nine-tails for water theft, and then rubbing an extremely painful mixture of rum, gunpowder, and salt into their wounds. But going back to the mutiny, Captain Ferrer hoped it was simply one driven by extreme hunger, and thus giving the captives food would put an end to it. Unfortunately for him, they were not driven by hunger, but by fear for their very lives, and thus ignored the bread. In the subsequent melee, Captain Ferrer killed 2 of his attackers and wounded several others, which enraged the rest, causing them to press the attack with vigor. Not long after, 2 of the crewmen, seeing that they would all soon be overwhelmed, tossed a canoe overboard and jumped ship, leaving their 4 surviving crewmates to fend for themselves. The 2 injured sailors then paddled for 18 miles back to the mainland, with one of them later claiming, to quote him, "The captain was warned previous to sailing to keep a lookout for the Negroes as they had attempted to rise and take the vessel in which they were brought from Africa." Back aboard the Amistad, Mates would later give an account of what happened to him during the uprising, stating, "I went on deck and they attacked me. I seized a stick and a knife with a view to defend myself. At this time, Cinque wounded me on the head severely with one of the sugar knives, also on the arm. I then ran below and stowed myself between 2 barrels wrapped up in a sail. Cinque rushed after me and attempted to kill me, but was prevented by the interference of another man, Berna. As for Ruiz, he was similarly quelled, but the captain was not so lucky. After repeated slashes all over his body, he finally collapsed on the deck. At this point, he was beheaded, and the former captives celebrated their victory and newfound freedom with their native war dance ritual, Kutu. In the end, of the former crew, 2 were dead, 2 jumped overboard, and 3, Ruiz, Montes, and the captain's surviving slave, cabin boy Antonio, were bound and held in the hold. At this point, while the new masters of the ship did to an extent know how to handle it from a practical standpoint, they did not have the expertise to navigate the open ocean with any degree of accuracy other than a general cardinal direction in the daytime. Thus, they recruited Ruiz and Montes to help get them to Africa. This proved their undoing. The August 26, 1839 edition of the New London Gazette would describe what happened next. Montes was ordered to change the course again for the coast of Africa, the Negroes themselves steering by the sun in the daytime, while at night he would alter their course so as to bring them back to their original place of destination. They remained 3 days off Long Island to the eastward of Providence, after which time they were 2 months on the ocean, sometimes steering to the eastward, and whenever an occasion would permit, the whites would alter the course to the northward and westward, always in hopes of falling in with some vessel of war or being enabled to run into some port when they would be relieved from their horrid situation. As alluded to there, they continued on in this way for some 56 days before finally landing off Montauk Point, Long Island, New York on August the 26th, 1839. Here upon landing, 4 of the former captives encountered 2 sea captains, Henry Green and Paletia Fordham, who were shooting birds nearby. While attempting to get help from the 2 men via intimating they would like to trade some of the Amistad's goods for supplies to continue their voyage, the precursor to the U.S. Coast Guard, the United States Revenue Cutter Service, showed up and boarded the Amistad. Unfortunately, it was at this point that Lieutenant Thomas Gedney, in charge of the Revenue Marine vessel, the Washington, discovered Ruiz and Montes. The pair subsequently told the tale of the mutiny and killings from their perspective. The mutineers, unable to speak English or Spanish, had no rebuttal. Feeling it was a rather clear-cut case of a slave revolt resulting in murder and piracy, Lieutenant Gedney, with guns trained on them, once again took these individuals' freedoms, and then made the rather curious decision to bring the Amistad and its occupants to New London, Connecticut, instead of a much closer port in New York. As to why, Gedney and company were going to claim salvage rights, and slavery was illegal in New York, but not in Connecticut. Had they landed in New York, while they still could claim their percentage of the $40,000 or so, about $1.1 million today, of other cargo, they'd have potentially had much more difficulty leveraging the value of the slaves, as mentioned, worth an estimated $20,000 or about $570,000 today. Of their newfound liberation, Ruiz and Montes would subsequently write a letter sent to the New London, Connecticut newspaper stating, Don Jose Ruiz and Don Pedro Montes, in gratitude for their most unhoped for and most providential rescue from the hands of a ruthless gang of African buccaneers and an awful death, would take this means of expressing in some slight degree their thankfulness and obligations to Lieutenant Commander T.R. Gedney and the officers and crew of the U.S. surveying brig Washington for their decision in seizing the Amistad and their unremitting kindness and hospitality in providing for their comfort on board their vessel, as well as the means they have taken for the protection of their property. We also must express our indebtedness to that nation whose flag they so worthily bear, with an assurance that this act will be duly appreciated by our most gracious sovereign, Her Majesty the Queen of Spain. Of course, whether the Amistad really had been taken by a ruthless gang of African buccaneers was still a matter for the courts to decide, and the fact that Montes and Ruiz just explicitly and very publicly called them Africans instead of Ladinos, as their legal documents stated, was a potentially interesting admission from them for reasons we'll get into shortly. Also to still be decided was if the US had jurisdiction to prosecute the case, even if the pair's story was accurate. On that note, US Attorney for the District of Connecticut, William Hollibird, who would soon after serve as the Lieutenant Governor of Connecticut, like Lieutenant Gedney before him, felt it was a pretty open and shut case of mutiny and murder. However, given the alleged crimes occurred on a Spanish vessel in international waters and nobody aboard was from the United States, he felt that the court should bow to President Martin Van Buren's wishes and deliver the captives and the Amistad back to Spanish control to let them sort the matter out. Hollibird would also write to the Secretary of State, John Forsyth, that I should regret extremely if the rascally blacks should fall into the hands of the abolitionists with whom Hartford is filled. To take the first steps to resolve all this, on August the 29th, Connecticut Judge Andrew T. Judson opened a hearing aboard the USS Washington to address the accusations by Montes and Ruiz that the Africans had committed acts of piracy and murder. The point of this first hearing, however, was not to determine their innocence or guilt, but rather simply to see if there was enough legal basis to hold a criminal trial about it at all. In the end, Judge Judson ruled there was enough evidence to hold a trial, with the prisoners then taken to the county jail in New Haven to await their court date before the circuit court in Hartford. This created something of a circus at the jail, with reportedly as many as a few thousand people per day coming to see them, and their jailer making quite a profit, charging about 12 cents, about $3 today, per visitor wanting an up-close look. Illustrating the appalling conditions aboard the slave ships, an interesting thing to note here is that despite being in jail, the prisoners were arguably treated, if not well per se, much better than they were aboard the Amistad, and their survival rates, while still not perfect, also markedly improved, as we'll get into later. As to that treatment, abolitionist Lewis Tappan, who had helped champion their cause, wrote on September the 9th, 1839, "The prisoners are in comfortable rooms. They are well clothed in dark striped cotton trousers, called by some of the manufacturers hard times, and in striped cotton shirts. The girls are in calico frocks and have made the little shawls that were given them into turbans. The prisoners eyed the clothes some time and laughed a good deal among themselves before they put them on. Their food is brought to them in separate tin pans, and they eat it in an orderly manner. In general, general, they're in good health. One of their number, however, died on Tuesday last, and 2 or 3 more are on the sick list and considered dangerous. They probably suffer for want of exercise in the open air. The 4 children are apparently from 10 to 12 years of age. They are robust and are full of hilarity. The sheriff of the county took them to ride in a wagon on Friday. At first, their eyes were filled with tears and they seemed to be afraid, but soon they enjoyed themselves very well and appeared to be greatly delighted. The children speak only their native dialects. Neither Cinques nor any of his comrades have been manacled since they have been here. Their demeanor is altogether quiet, kind, and orderly. Speaking of Tappan, the prisoners weren't just attracting random gawkers to the jail, but also, as Holabird had feared, abolitionists to their cause. Tappan stated he and his fellow abolitionists hoped these individuals' story would touch, to quote, the heart of the nation through the power of sympathy and hasten the overthrow of slavery. And so it was that Tappan & Co. on September the 4th set up the Friend of Amistad Africans Committee to raise funds for the prisoners and find the best legal help they could, ultimately settling on one Roger Baldwin, who, by the way, would later become governor of Connecticut. Shortly after this committee was established, Spanish Minister Chevalier de Arguelles would formally demand the prisoners be returned to Cuba for trial, citing treaties with Spain which required the returning of Spanish ships and property seized by U.S. government ships to Spain. In particular, the 1795 Treaty of Friendship, Limits, and Navigation, which, among other things, in Article 9 states, all ships and merchandise of what nature soever which shall be rescued out of the hands of any pirates or robbers on the high seas shall be brought into some port of either state and shall be delivered to the custody of the officers of that port in order to be taken care of and restored entire to the true proprietor as soon as due and sufficient proof shall be made concerning the property thereof. And as for that proof that the individuals involved in the mutiny were, in fact, legal property, Ruiz and Montes had documents signed by none other than the Governor General of Cuba asserting this fact. And as to the criminal matter, the Spanish minister further stated, I do not in fact understand how a foreign court of justice can be considered competent to take cognizance of an offense committed on board of a Spanish vessel by Spanish subjects and against Spanish subjects in waters of a Spanish territory, for it was committed on the coast of this island and under the flag of this nation. As mentioned, U.S. President Martin Van Buren was in complete agreement over this, perhaps less out of obligation to Spain and more to help him not alienate some of his slave state supporters. Thus, he instructed Holabird to do his best to make this happen. Now, as to the upcoming trial, a rather glaring problem continued to be that neither Baldwin nor anyone else that could be found could actually speak to the defendants in the language either side understood. To attempt to get around the issue, Baldwin sought out Yale professor of linguistics, Dr. Josiah Gibbs. Unfortunately, even for such a distinguished linguist, learning the defendant's language, or any of the defendants learning English in time for the trial, was out of the question. But Gibbs did have a bright idea on how to possibly get around the problem. After being brought to the prisoners, he quickly learned to count to 10 in their language. From here, he simply went down to the docks of New York, counting in this language loudly until he finally found 2 people who recognized what he was saying. One Charles Pratt, and, more significant to the trial to come, a young man by the name of James Covey. As a young boy growing up in a village in Sierra Leone, Covey had been captured by a neighboring tribe and made a slave of the chief's wife of that tribe. A few years later, he was sold and put on the Spanish ship Segundo Socorro. Lucky for him, however, while en route, the slave ship was discovered by a British cruiser and the captives freed, and Covey given into the care of one Reverend John William Weeks. 5 years later, at the age of only around 14 years old, he joined the British Royal Navy, ultimately serving aboard the British man-of-war, the Buzzard, which just so happened to be in New York Harbor when Dr. Gibbs was searching for a translator. After Gibbs discussed the matter with Covey, he agreed to come speak to the prisoners, and on September the 9th, the prisoners' side of the story finally came out. They stated that, much like Covey, they were from various Mende tribes from Sierra Leone. After being captured by other Africans, they were taken to the infamous slave factory Lomboko, where they and several hundred others were sold to a Portuguese slave trader and then transported aboard a Portuguese ship called the Tagora across the Atlantic to Havana under rather brutal conditions. Covey would translate the captives' description of their transport, ultimately published in the New York Journal of Commerce. On board the vessel, there was a large number of men, but the women and children were by far the most numerous. They were fastened together by couples by their wrists and legs and kept in that situation day and night. By day, it was no better. The space between the decks was so small, according to their account not exceeding 4 feet, that they were obliged, if they attempted to stand, to keep a crouching posture. The decks, fore and aft, were crowded to overflowing. They suffered terribly. They had rice enough to eat, but they had very little to drink. If they left any of the rice that was given to them uneaten, either from sickness or any other cause, they were whipped. It was a common thing for them to be forced to eat so much as to vomit. All total, around 150 people, or about 1/3 of the prisoners, died along the way, their bodies unceremoniously tossed overboard. Upon arrival in Havana, the captives were sent to the slave market and, 10 days later, purchased by Ruiz and Montes and brought to the Amistad. As previously described, on the 4th night aboard, the prisoners managed to free themselves and took the ship, which brings us back up to date. What is critical to understand about all of this is that if these individuals were telling the truth, upon arrival in Cuba, the captives should have been immediately freed, as about 2 decades earlier, a treaty had been signed by Spain and Britain outlawing such importation of slaves into Spanish-held territories. Thus, if true, it was Ruiz and Montes who were the oppressors and even potentially murderers, giving some of the defendants had died after only a few days under their brutal care. And so it was that a little over a week after Covey was found to translate for the prisoners on September the 19th, 1839, with Judge Smith Thompson presiding, the Amistad case was heard. On the prosecution side, as alluded to, Holabird argued that because this was a matter that had international implications, the court should allow the president to determine the correct course, with said president advocating the prisoners simply be turned over to Spain for prosecution there as Spain had formally demanded. On the defense side, Baldwin argued that if the US took such a course, they would be reduced to slave catcher for foreign slaveholders, and that no power on earth has the right to reduce the defendants to slavery. After 3 days of arguments, Judge Thompson ruled that because the alleged crimes were committed in international waters aboard a Spanish ship, and further that no US citizens were involved, the court did not have jurisdiction to consider any criminal charges with regard to the mutiny. There was still, however, the matter of whether the prisoners were actually property or not. If so, by the aforementioned treaty between Spain and the United States, the US would be obliged to return them to Spanish control, regardless of any crimes committed or not. On this point, while Judge Thompson did rule that the Africans were no longer technically prisoners of the US, he nonetheless ordered that they should still be detained while the issue of their status as property was resolved, while also expressing strong doubt that they were actually legally slaves. In the ensuing couple months between Judge Thompson's ruling and the next trial under Judge Judson this time, the prisoners spent much of their time being taught English and Christian theology by the abolitionists. In the meantime, President Van Buren, via Secretary of State Forsyth, sent the naval schooner Grampus to take the Amistad and prisoners back to Havana if the court ruled in the government's favor, and to do so immediately before any appeal could be filed. This plan was abandoned, however, when Baldwin produced the aforementioned Dr. Gibbs, who pointed out to the court that none of the Africans, not even the children, spoke Spanish, and rather Mende and other languages from around the region of Sierra Leone. A rather curious fact if they had indeed been born and raised or living in Cuba for at least the last 19 years, as the prosecution and Amistad's legal documents claimed. Further, Covey, translating for the defendants, described how he had discussed with the defendants various landmarks and rivers and the like in the Sierra Leone that he had also been to, and it matched with the defendants' accounts of these places. On top of this, another witness was produced, one Sullivan Haley, serving aboard the Washington, claiming that Ruiz had told him the slaves were indeed imported recently from Africa. With Britain at this point pressuring the US to let the captives go, Baldwin also brought in British anti-slavery commissioner in Cuba, Dr. Richard Madden, to testify. Dr. Madden stated, "I have examined the defendants and observed their language, appearance, and manners, and I have no doubt of their having been very recently brought from Africa." He goes on, "One of the largest dealers and importers of the island of Cuba in African slaves is the notorious house of Martiniere and Co. of Havana. And for years past, as at present, they have been deeply engaged in the traffic, and the Bozal Africans imported by these and all other slave traders, when brought to the Havana, are immediately taken to the barracoons or slave marts, and from these barracoons they are taken and removed to the different parts of the island when sold. And having examined the endorsements on the back of the traspaso, or permits for the removal of said Negroes of the Amistad, the signature to that endorsement appears to be that of Martiniere and Co., and the document purports to be a permit of pass for the removal of said Negroes. Any Negroes landed in the island since 1820 and carried into slavery have been illegally introduced, and the transfer of them under false names, such as calling Bozal Ladinos, is necessarily a fraud. Unfortunately, there is no interference on the part of the local authorities. They connive at it and collude with the slave traders, the governor alone at the Havana receiving a bounty or impost on each Negro thus illegally introduced of $10 per head. He further stated, "I have full knowledge of the slave trade in Cuba, and I know that no law exists or has existed since the year 1820 that sanctions the introduction of Negroes into the island of Cuba from Africa for the purpose of making slaves or being held in slavery, and that all such bozal Negroes, as those recently imported are called, are legally free, and no law, common, or statute exists there by which they can be held in slavery." On the flip side, continuing to bang the same drum as before, Holabird, along with presenting the testimonies of the U.S. Revenue Marines concerning the events surrounding the capture of the Amistad, continued to cite Spanish and U.S. treaties, as well as pointing out that this all occurred on a Spanish vessel, and thus the matter should be resolved either way by the Spanish courts. And as to the question of the status of property, he pointed out that legal documents aboard the Amistad signed by the Governor General of Cuba clearly showed the defendants were lying, and they were, in fact, longtime residents of Cuba and legal slaves there, and that the U.S. courts had no right to declare the Spanish government had been party to illegally making slaves out of the captured Africans. And just as a brief aside here, neither Montez nor Ruiz chose to testify, despite, in Ruiz's case, standing to lose about $500,000 in modern dollars if the court ruled in favor of his supposed slaves. As to why they didn't testify, it's generally thought the men did not want to open themselves up for prosecution for perjury by stating under oath that their supposed slaves were not recent imports from Africa. Further, there was a chance they could be tried for other crimes as well if it turned out their captives had actually been free individuals under their brutal care. Thus, they had not bothered to stick around after being charged with such crimes and briefly imprisoned in October of 1939 in New York. At separate points after this, both posted bail and returned to Cuba, with it not fully clear what happened to them after, other than that they, like all of us someday will do, eventually became microbial excrement. So what did Judge Judson think of all this? On January the 13th, he ruled that, regardless of what the Spanish government said, the Africans aboard the Amistad had been kidnapped and were thus justified in their mutiny out of, to quote, desire of winning their liberty and of returning to their families and kindred. While the court did acknowledge only a Spanish court could rule on the question of murder and piracy under Spanish law, because the Africans were not legally slaves, nor were they Spanish citizens, there was no legal obligation to return them to Spanish control to resolve such a matter. Instead, he ordered they be delivered to the president, not for him to put them back in Spanish hands, as had been the president's plan with the Grampus and Harbor, but with Judge Judson citing the 1819 Slave Trade Act in order to be transported back to their homes in Sierra Leone immediately at the U.S. government's expense. As a brief aside here, Judge Judson also ruled that the cabin boy, Antonio, was a legal slave and thus belonged to Captain Ferrer's heirs and should be returned to Cuba as Spain had requested. There are conflicting accounts, however, of what happened to him after this, with one side stating he was indeed returned to Cuba, and the other that abolitionists helped him escape to Canada before he could be deported. Whatever the case there, not taking the matter sitting down, President Van Buren ordered the decision appealed, which was subsequently done. However, it was then upheld by the aforementioned Circuit Judge Smith Thompson. From here, once again, Van Buren and the Spanish side appealed the decision, with the case now to be heard once and for all before the U.S. Supreme Court. While Baldwin had arguably done a phenomenal job defending the prisoners up to this point, arguing a case in front of the Supreme Court is no small thing, even for an experienced attorney. Thus, the Amistad Committee wanted someone with prior experience arguing before that venerated body to help Baldwin out. Towards this end, they sought out Old Man Eloquent himself, former U.S. President John Quincy Adams, who, by the way, had once been appointed to and turned down a Supreme Court seat, one of only 7 people in all of U.S. history to turn down such a position once their nomination was confirmed. In order to recruit Adams to the cause, on October the 27th, 1840, Lewis Tappan and company visited Adams personally at Adams's home in Quincy, Massachusetts. And as a brief aside here, if you're now wondering, the town Quincy was not named after the former president, but rather when it was incorporated in 1792, it was named after John Quincy Adams' great-grandfather on his mother's side, Colonel John Quincy, a prominent individual in Braintree, which Quincy, Massachusetts sprang from. And yes, once again, contrary to popular belief, this should be pronounced Quincy rather than Quincy. In any event, Adams initially turned down Tappan's request. This was not because he didn't wholly support the rightness of the cause. Indeed, Adams spent a large percentage of his post-presidential career working toward the abolition of slavery in Congress right up to his sudden death on February the 23rd, 1848, when he collapsed on the floor of that very institution after standing to argue a point by another member of Congress. On the issue of slavery, Adams would also write in his journal, "What can I, upon the verge of my 74th birthday, with a shaking hand, a darkening eye, a drowsy brain, and with all my faculties dropping from me one by one as the teeth are dropping from my head, what can I do for the cause of God and man, for the progress of human emancipation? Yet my conscience presses me on. Let me but die upon the breach." Adams had also on November the 19th, 1839, almost a year before Tappan's request, written a letter published in the New York Journal of Commerce advocating for the defendant's cause, stating, "The Africans of the Amistad were cast upon our coast in a condition perhaps as calamitous as could befall human beings, not by their own will, not with any intention hostile or predatory on their part, not even by an act of God, as in the case of a shipwreck, but by their own ignorance of navigation, but by the deception of one of their oppressors whom they had overpowered, and whose life they had spared to enable them by his knowledge of navigation to reach their native land. They were victims of the African slave trade recently imported into the island of Cuba in gross violation of the laws of the island and of Spain, and by acts which our own laws have made piracy punishable with death. They had indicated their natural right to liberty by conspiracy, insurrection, homicide, and capture, and they were accused by the 2 Cuban Spaniards embarked with them in the ship of murder and piracy, and they were claimed by the same 2 Cuban Spaniards, accessories after the fact to the slave trade piracy by which they had been brought from Africa to Cuba as their property, because they had bought them from slave trade pirates. They knew nothing of the Constitution, laws, or language of the country upon which they were thus thrown and accused as pirates and murderers. Claimed as slaves of the very men who were their captives, they were deprived even of the faculty of speech in their own defense. This condition was solely calamitous. It claimed from the humanity of a civilized nation compassion. It claimed from brotherly love of a Christian land sympathy. It claimed from a republic professing reverence for the rights of man justice. And what have we done? A naval officer of the United States seizes them, their ship and cargo, with themselves, tramples on the territorial jurisdiction of the state of New York by seizing, disarming, and sending on board their ship, without a warrant of arrest, several of them whom he found on shore, releases their captives, admits the claim of the 2 captives to 50 masters as their slaves, and claims salvage for restoring them to servitude. They are then brought before a court of the United States at once upon the charge of piracy and murder, upon a claim to them as slaves, and upon a claim against their pretended masters for salvage by kidnapping them again into slavery. The circuit judge decides that the United States do not exercise the right of all other civilized nations to try piracy committed in foreign vessels, that he thereupon cannot try them for piracy or murder, but that the district court may try whether they are slaves or not. Is this compassion? Is it sympathy? Is it justice? But here the case now stands. So given all this, why did Adams not want to take this case he felt so passionately about? He wrote in his journal on October the 27th, 1840, "I endeavored to excuse myself upon the plea of my age and inefficiency, of the oppressive burden of my duties as a member of the House of Representatives, and my inexperience after a lapse of more than 30 years in the forms and technicals of arguments before judicial tribunals, and said I would cheerfully do what I had heretofore offered, that is, give any assistance of counsel and advice to Mr. Baldwin and any other person charged with the argument before the court." Not taking no for an answer, however, Adams would go on, "But they urged me so much and represented the case of those unfortunate men as so critical, it being a case of life and death, that I yielded, and told them that, if by the blessing of God my health and strength should permit, I would argue the case before the Supreme Court, and I implore the mercy of Almighty God to control my temper, to enlighten my soul, and to give my utterance that I may prove myself in every respect equal to the task." Upon hearing of their new defender, one of the Africans, Kali, would write to Adams making sure he understood their position, stating, "I want to write a letter to you because you love Mendi people and you talk to the great court. Want to tell you one thing. Jose Ruiz say we born in Havana. He tell lie. We all born in Mendi. We no understand Spanish language. We want you to ask the court what we have done wrong. What for Americans keep us in prison? Some people say Mendi people crazy dolts because we no talk American language. Americans no talk Mendi. American people crazy dolts? They tell bad things about Mendi people and we no understand. Dear friend Mr. Adams, you have children and friends. You love them. You feel very sorry if Mendi people come and take all to Africa. From here, Adams would visit his new clients to hear more of their side personally, as well as spend the next several months working with Baldwin on their defense. During this time, it's interesting to note that Adams, before the U.S. House of Representatives, formally accused President Martin Van Buren's administration of intentionally falsifying documents in the Amistad case via intentionally mistranslating Spanish documents to mislead the courts. A committee was then assigned to investigate the matter, with it ultimately appearing that this indeed had occurred. However, the House chose not to censure the administration or otherwise do anything about it. In any event, finally on February the 22nd, 1841, almost 2 full years after the Amistad captives successfully freed themselves aboard the ship, and with over a dozen of them dying in the interim, Baldwin and Adams stood together before the Supreme Court in the case of United States versus Schooner Amistad. As for the government side, Attorney General Henry Gilpin mostly just, as had been so unsuccessful before, presented the Amistad's legal papers clearly showing that the Africans were legal slaves under Spanish law, with none other than the Spanish government putting their stamp on the validity of the documents. From there, his main point was that the court had no authority to deny the veracity of the Amistad's papers concerning the human property aboard. If the Spanish government asserted the Africans were legal slaves, then what right did a U.S. court have to claim otherwise? The U.S. side also made the rather bizarre argument that because the Africans had been in command of a slave ship and landed in the United States, they had violated slave trade laws by importing slaves to the United States. We'll fast forward to the end on this particular point right now and say the Supreme Court rejected this argument, noting the Africans could not, to quote, possibly intend to import themselves into the United States as slaves or for sale as slaves. Moving over to the defense, as for Baldwin's argument, he countered, "It is a remarkable circumstance that though more than a year has elapsed since the decree of the district court denying the title of Ruiz and Montez and pronouncing the Africans free, not a particle of evidence has since been produced in support of their claims. And yet, strange as it may seem, during all this time, not only the sympathies of the Spanish minister, but the powerful aid of our own government have been enlisted in their behalf." He further went on that given Spain had previously signed agreements to prohibit such importing of slaves from Africa, it may be admitted that even after such an enunciation, our cruisers could not lawfully seize a Spanish slaver, cleared out as such by the governor of Cuba. But if the Africans on board of her could effect their own deliverance and reach our shores, has not the government of Spain authorized us to treat them with hospitality as freemen? Could the Spanish minister, without offense, ask the government of the United States to seize these victims of fraud and felony and treat them as property because the colonial governor had thought proper to violate the ordinance of his king in granting a permit to a slaver? Besides these arguments, the main thrust of his defense was simply the same that had worked in the lower courts. Summing up, Cinque, the master spirit who guided them, had a single object in view. That object was not piracy or robbery, but the deliverance of himself and his companions in suffering from unlawful bondage. They owed no allegiance to Spain. They were on board of the Amistad by constraint. Their object was to free themselves from the fetters that bound them in order that they might return to their kindred and their home. In so doing, they were guilty of no crime for which they could be held responsible as pirates. For Adams' part, on February the 24th and finishing on March the 1st, he gave a total of an almost 9-hour and 135-page speech. Like Baldwin, he cited both legal justification for freeing his clients, including once again reiterating that their importation to Cuba was in direct violation of the treaty between Britain and Spain, which strictly prohibited importing slaves to the Spanish colonies. He also put forth moral reasoning, drawing from the very founding documents of the United States itself. Justice Story would later state of Adams' argument, it was extraordinary for its power, for its bitter sarcasm, and for its dealing with topics far beyond the record and points of discussion. As for his own account, Adams would write in his journal of his initial February the 24th speech, "The courtroom was full but not crowded, and there were not many ladies. I had been deeply distressed and agitated till the moment when I rose, and then my spirit did not sink within me. With grateful heart for aid from above, though in humiliation for the weakness incident to the limits of my powers, I spoke." During his speech, he stated, "I appear here on the behalf of 36 individuals, the life and liberty of every one of whom depend on the decision of this court. 3 or 4 of them are female children, incapable in the judgment of our laws of the crimes of murder or piracy, or perhaps of any other crime. Yet from the day when the vessel was taken possession of by one of our naval officers, they have all been held as close prisoners, now for the period of 18 long months. Was ever such a scene of Lilliputian trickery enacted by the rulers of a great, magnanimous, and Christian nation? Contrast it with the act of self-emancipation by which Cinque and Grabo liberated themselves and their fellow suffering countrymen from Spanish slave traders, and which the Secretary of State denominates lawless violence. Cinque and Grabo are uncouth and barbarous names. Call them Harmodius and Aristogiton, and go back for moral principle 3,000 years to the fierce and glorious democracy of Athens. They too resorted to lawless violence and slew the tyrant to redeem the freedom of their country. When they were brought from Lamboco in the Tacora against the laws of Spain, against the laws of the United States, and against the laws of nations, so far as the United States and Spain and Great Britain are concerned, who were the robbers and pirates? And when the same voyage, in fact, was continued in the Amistad and the Africans were in a perishing condition in the hands of Ruiz, dropping dead from day to day under his treatment, were they the pirates and robbers? This honorable court will observe from the record that there were 54 Africans who left Havana. Ruiz says in his libel that 9 had died before they reached our shores. The marshal's return shows that they were dying day after day from the effects of their sufferings. 1 died before the court sat in New London. 3 more died before the return was made to the court at Hartford, only 17 days, and 3 more between that and November. 16 fell victim before November, and from that time, not 1 has died. Think only of the relief and benefit of being restored to the absolute wants of human nature. Although placed in a condition which, if applied to 40 citizens of the United States, we should call cruel, shut up 18 months in prison, and enjoying only the tenderness of which our laws provide for the worst of criminals, so great is their improvement of their condition from what it was in the hands of Ruiz that they have perfectly recovered their health, and not 1 has died, when before that time they were perishing from hour to hour. He then turned his ire onto the United States Revenue Cutter Service's conduct in this, stating upon their discovery of the Amistad, "In this situation, Lieutenant Gedney, without any charge or authority from his government, without warrant of law, by force of firearms, seizes and disarms them, then being in the peace of that Commonwealth and of the United States, drives them on board the vessel, seizes the vessel and transfers it against the will of its possessors to another state, I ask in the name of justice, by what law was this done?" One of the judges who presided in some of the preceding trials is said to have called this an anomalous case. It is indeed anomalous, and I know of no law but one which I am not at liberty to argue before this court. No law, statute, or constitution, no code, no treaty applicable to the proceedings of the executive or the judiciary except that law. He then pointed to the copy of the Declaration of Independence hanging against one of the pillars, stating, "The moment you come to the Declaration of Independence that every man has a right to life and liberty, an inalienable right, this case is decided. I ask nothing more on behalf of these unfortunate men than this declaration." He concluded, once again appealing to the justice's morals by discussing his previous appearances before that very court for other cases in the distant past, noting how the justices then so many years before had now gone on to meet their maker, stating, "Where are they all? Gone, gone, all gone. Gone from the services which, in their day and generation, they faithfully rendered to their country. In taking then my final leave of this bar and of this honorable court, I can only ejaculate a fervent petition to heaven that every member of it may go to his final account with as little of earthly frailty to answer for as those illustrious dead, and that you may, every one, after the close of a long and virtuous career in this world, be received at the portals of this next with the approving sentence, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord.'" In the end, on March the 9th, 1841, the court, via Justice Joseph Story, announced their ruling in a 7-1 decision, that the individuals who'd mutinied aboard the Amistad were in fact kidnapped Africans who by the laws of Spain itself were entitled to their freedom. Although public documents of the government accompanying property found on board of a private ship of a foreign nation certainly are to be deemed prima facie evidence of the facts which they purport to state, yet they are always open to be impugned for fraud, and whether that fraud be in the original obtaining of these documents or in the subsequent fraudulent and illegal use of them, when once it is satisfactorily established, it overthrows all their sanctity and destroys them as proof. that supposing these African Negroes not to be slaves but kidnapped and free Negroes, the treaty with Spain cannot be obligatory upon them, and the United States are bound to respect their rights as much as those of the Spanish subjects. The conflicts of rights between the parties under such circumstances becomes positive and inevitable, and must be decided upon the eternal principles of justice and international law. Upon the merits of the case, then, there does not seem to us to be any ground for doubt that these Negroes ought to be deemed free, and that the Spanish treaty interposes no obstacle to the just assertion of their rights. However, the court also ruled that, contrary to what had previously been ruled, the 1819 Slave Trade Treaty did not apply here, and thus the U.S. was under no obligation to help return these individuals to Sierra Leone. As for what happened after, funds were raised for their care and even to pay for John Quincy Adams's services helping to defend them, though Adams refused this payment. Along with sending him a gift of a Bible, which today is part of the collection at the Stone Library in Quincy, Massachusetts, the former captives would write a group letter to Adams thanking him on May the 5th, 1841. They wrote, "We thank you very much because you make us free. They give you money for Mendi people and you say you will not take it. We pray for all the good people who make us free. Wicked people want to make us slaves, but the great God who has made all things raise up friends for Mendi people. He give us Mr. Adams that he may make me free and all Mendi people free." From here all the way to his death in 1847, Adams also successfully led the opposition to efforts by 4 different US presidents to compensate Spain for their losses in the Amistad case. In fact, after Adams's death, 4 additional presidents advocated for this as well, with Spain only giving up in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln became the 16th US president. As for the now freed Africans, from here they went to Farmington, Connecticut, where they were further educated, as well as were occasionally sent around New England at various locations to describe their kidnapping and ordeal to aid in the abolition cause. It was noted that Cinque particularly soon became a skilled speaker at these events. Finally, in November of 1841, enough money, almost $2,000 or about $60,000 today, was raised to charter a ship, the Gentleman, to take those who wanted to back home, as well as to establish a mission in the region. Departing on December the 4th, the 35 of the remaining 53 former captives, along with Covey and 4 American missionaries, headed east to the Sierra Leone. 50 days later, they arrived at Freetown Harbor. Cinque would write back to Tappan shortly after. Cinque loved Mr. Tappan very much, and all Mendi people love Mr. Tappan very much. I no forget Mr. Tappan forever and ever, and I no forget God, because God helped Mr. Tappan and Mendi people. I thank all American people for they send Mendi people home. Your friend, Cinque. Another of the former captives, Kin Na, would also write Tappan, "We have reached Sierra Leone, and one little while after we go Mendi, and we get land very safely. We have been on great water. Not any danger fell upon us. I never forget you. If I never see you in this world, we will meet in heaven." That said, it is noted that much to the chagrin of the missionaries, many of the former captives would eventually abandon Christianity and return to the practices of their own people, rather than help them establish the mission as was initially hoped. Further, it was not all a happy return for some of them. Cinque, for example, would return home to find his village had been destroyed by a neighboring tribe, and to make matters worse, his wife and his children had been sold into slavery with no idea as to where they ended up in the world. Many years later, Cinque was the last of the former captives to contact the mission. Near death in 1879, he returned and spent his remaining time on Earth there, ultimately buried in a small graveyard on the mission grounds.